And halfway between the edge of the plain and this highest pinnacle of rock, utterly hidden from the eyes of both man and beast, nestled the hiding place which Jolly Roger and Peter had found. It was a cool and cavernous spot, in spite of the Sahara-like heat of the great pile. In the very heart of it two gigantic masses of rock had put their shoulders together, like Gog and Magog, so that under their 10,000 tons of weight was a crypt-like tunnel as high as a man's head, into which the light and the glare of the sun never came. Peter, now that he had grown accustomed to the deadness of it, liked this change from Indian Tom's cabin. He liked his wallow of soft sand during the day, and he liked still more the aloneness and the aloofness of their ramparted stronghold when the cool of evening came. He did not, of course, understand just what their escape from Cassidy had meant, but instinct was shrewdly at work within him, and no wolf could have guarded the place more carefully than he. And he had all creation in mind when he guarded the rock pile. All but Nada. Many times he whimpered for her, just as the great call for her was in Jolly Roger's own heart. And on this third afternoon, as the hot July sun dipped halfway to the western forests, both Peter and his master were looking yearningly, and with the same thought, toward the east, where over the backbone of Cragg's Ridge Jed Hawkins' cabin lay. "We'll let her know tonight," Roger McKay said at last, with something very slow and deliberate in his voice. "We'll take the chance, and let her know." Peter's bristling Airedale whiskers, standing out like a bunch of broom splints about his face, quivered sympathetically, and he thumped his tail in the sand. He was an artful hypocrite, was Peter, because he always looked as if he understood, whether he did or not. And Jolly Roger, staring at the gray rock-backs outside their tunnel door, went on. "We must play square with her, Pied-Bot, and it's a crime worse than murder not to let her know the truth. If she wasn't a kid, Peter. But she's that, just a kid, the sweetest, purest thing God A'mighty ever made, and it isn't fair to live this lie any longer, no matter how we love her. And we do love her, Peter." Peter lay very quiet, watching the strange, gray look that had settled in Jolly Roger's face. "I've got to tell her that I'm a damned highwayman," he added, in a moment. "And she won't understand, Peter. She can't. But I'm going to do it. I'm going to tell her today. And then I think we'll be hitting north pretty soon, Pied-Bot. And if it wasn't for Jed Hawkins—" He rose up out of the sand, his hands clenched. "We ought to kill Jed Hawkins before we go. It would be safer for her," he finished. He went out, forgetting Peter, and climbed a rock-splintered path until he stood on the knob of a mighty boulder, looking off into the northern wilderness. Off there, 100, 500, 1,000 miles, was home. It was all his home, from Hudson's Bay to the Rockies, from the height of land to the Arctic plains, and in it he had lived the thrill of life according to his own peculiar code. He knew that he had loved life as few had ever loved it. He had worshipped the sun and the moon and the stars. The world had been a glorious place in which to live, in spite of its ceaseless peril for him. But there was nothing of cheer left in his heart now as he stood in the blaze of the setting sun. Paradise had come to him for a little while, and because of it he had lived a lie. He had not told Jed Hawkins' foster girl that he was an outlaw, and that he had come to the edge of civilization because he thought it was the last place the Royal Mounted would look for him. When he went to her this evening it would probably be for the last time. He would tell her the truth. He would tell her the police were after him from one end of the Canadian Northland to the other. And that same night, with Peter, he would hit the trail for the Barren Lands, 1,000 miles away. He was sure of himself now, sure even as the dark wall of the forest across the plain faded out and gave place to a pale, girlish face with eyes blue as flowers and brown curls filled with the luster of the sun, a face that had taken the place of mother, sister, and God deep down in his soul. Yes, he was sure of himself, even with that face rising to give battle to his last great test of honor. He was an outlaw, and the police wanted him. But Peter was troubled by the grimness that settled in his master's face. They waited for dusk, and when deep shadows had gathered in the valley, McKay led the way out of the rock pile. An hour later they came cautiously through the darkness that lay between the broken shoulders of Cragg's Ridge. There was a light in the cabin, but Nada's window was dark. Peter crouched down under the warning pressure of McKay's hand. "I'll go on alone," he said. "You stay here." It seemed a long time that he waited in the darkness. He could not hear the low tap, tap, tap of his master's fingers against the glass of Nada's darkened window. And Jolly Roger, in response to that signal tapping, heard nothing from within, except a monotone of voice that came from the outer room. For half an hour he waited, repeating the signals at intervals. At last a door opened, and Nada stood silhouetted against the light of the room beyond. McKay tapped again, very lightly, and the door closed quickly behind the girl. In a moment she was at the window, which was raised a little from the bottom. "Mr. Roger," she whispered. "Is it you?" "Yes," he said, finding a little hand in the darkness. "It's me." The hand was cold, and its fingers clung tightly to his, as if the girl was frightened. Peter, restless with waiting, had come up quietly in the dark, and he heard the low, trembling whisper of Nada's voice at the window. There was something in the note of it and in the caution of Jolly Roger's reply that held him stiff and attentive, his ears wide open for approaching sound. For several minutes he stood thus, and then the whispering voices at the window ceased, and he heard his master retreating very quietly through the night. When Jolly Roger spoke to him, back under the broken shoulder of the ridge, he did not know that Peter had stood near the window. McKay stood looking back at the pale glow of light in the cabin. "Something happened there tonight. Something she wouldn't tell me about," he said, speaking half to Peter and half to himself. "I could feel it. I wish I could have seen her face." He set out over the plain, and then, as if remembering that he must explain the matter to Peter, he said, "She can't get out tonight, Pied-Bot, but she'll come to us in the jackpines tomorrow afternoon. We'll have to wait." He tried to say the thing cheerfully, but between this night and tomorrow afternoon seemed an interminable time, now that he was determined to make a clean breast of his affairs to Nada, and leave the country. Most of that night he walked in the coolness of the moonlit plain, and for a long time he sat amid the flower-scented shadows of the trysting place in the heart of the jackpine clump, where Nada had a hidden place all her own. It was here that Peter discovered something which Jolly Roger could not see in the deep shadows, a bundle warm and soft and sweet, with the presence of Nada herself. It was hidden under a clump of young banksians, very carefully hidden, and tucked about with grass and evergreen boughs. When McKay left the jackpines, he wondered why it was that Peter showed no inclination to follow him until he was urged. They did not return to the stew kettle until dawn, and most of that day Jolly Roger spent in sleep between the two big rocks. It was late afternoon when they made their last meal. In this farewell hour McKay climbed up close to the pinnacle, where he smoked his pipe and measured the shadows of the declining sun, until it was time to leave for the jackpines. Retracing his steps to the hiding